Welcome, everybody. Thanks for coming to day 2 of the Kenyon College What Works conference, hosted by our Center for Innovative Pedagogy, of which I'm the director. I'm Joe Murphy. Even virtually, we should acknowledge that Kenyon College is on lands which were the ancestral homelands of the Miami, Lenape, Wyandot, and Shawnee peoples, among others, and that the disputed Treaty of Greenville and the forced removal of indigenous peoples from this region allowed for the founding of the college in the early 1800s and its continuance up to today. We just want to acknowledge as we get started that those are kind of the situations in which we exist, even in a virtual environment. We'll start off today with our workshop on Writing What Works with Anna Scanlon, who is the director of Kenyon College's Writing Center. Mm-hmm. Anna, over to you.
Awesome. So, yep, as Joe said, I'm Anna Scanlon. My pronouns are she, her, hers. I am actually fairly new to Kenyon College. This ended my first year here. I have worked in writing centers for over 10 years, though, so I have quite a bit of experience working both as a graduate student and now as a director in my own right at several different writing centers throughout the Midwest. If you have questions after this presentation, or you think of things after this presentation, you're like, oh, I wish I could ask her that, you can. Just please go ahead and email me. I'm more than happy to help, or to send sources again, or to share this PowerPoint or Google Slides, whatever you want to call it. If you lose access to it at any point, please let me know. Sometimes Google Docs and I are not friends. And I would say probably honestly, most of the time, Google Docs and I are not the friends I would like us to be. So please don't hesitate to reach out. All right. What you can reasonably expect to leave this workshop with is introductory information about several writing cultures, valued practices for supporting writers from across those cultures, including hands-on time to incorporate these practices into the work that we do, and then resources for further information on writing across cultures. So things that you might want to look into further on your own. And I do have alt text for all these images. This image is of our students in our Writing Center tutoring course, English 217, here at Kenyon. So these are students who are training to become Writing Center tutors. Toward the last day of class, so I always bring my dog in if they're okay with it, per their request usually. This class, I think they ended up with my dog like 4 times in class. So you can see her pictured there observing things as they are learning. All right, so first I want to start with just some general background as promised on sort of these writing cultures that I mentioned. And I do want to offer the caveat that these are not the only by any means writing cultures, but these are sort of the most distinct writing cultures when you're starting out experiencing, starting out to understand the differences that our students might be experiencing if they're coming from an international background, whether that be their own background or their family's background. Their time, their experiences with writing might be different than our own experiences with writing, unless of course we come from an international background, and then in that case we need to think about the ways in which our writing experiences may be different from the students we see in the classroom in a different way. And so I want to provide this background. So writer-responsible writing cultures are those cultures that emphasize writing in which the writer is responsible for communicating all meaning to the reader. And so in that case, the writer is responsible. So it's writer-responsible culture. They're focused on moving to the thesis quickly. So the thesis is going to show up usually at the end of that introductory paragraph in a more standard academic work. They'll have 2 to 3 main points in their more basic essays. So think of things like the 5-paragraph essay here, if you're familiar with that, where you have something like a 3-point thesis, and then 3 body paragraphs, each addressing one of the points of the thesis, and then a conclusion. Sometimes there might be a counter argument, and they'll usually end with a summary. Language is more spare here, and the prompts are more open here. So professors are more likely to say things like, create an argumentative essay about this literary work, right? Paragraphs in the style follow what we would consider a parallel progression, guiding the reader through each point. So some may look at this style of writing and think that it's obvious or simplistic or even narrow. Some reader responsible writers have even called it rude for being too much to the point, for not giving the reader any chance to do any inductive reasoning of their own. If outside sources are used or required, citations are always expected with this cultural writing form. And that citation style can vary widely, pardon me, from APA to MLA to Chicago. And I'll talk more about resources for that in a moment. Writer responsible cultures, if they sound familiar to you, you may have been taught them at some point. They're taught in most K through 12 American and British schools. I'll also say Irish schools for my family. Some differences on thesis and style placement might be noted in them from discipline to discipline, and the expectation will grow as students get to college, right? We're going to move past that 5-paragraph essay, hopefully in the longer college essays, though we'll probably still keep it around for things like the GRE and the short essay exam. Thesis statements are going to get more complex as we go throughout college. Use of evidence is going to get more involved. We're not going to have those floating quotes that we sometimes see in more, I don't want to say fresh papers or young papers, but in more early papers or early writing. And we'll see as the students reach college, hopefully more engagement with outside sources as well. Writers for whom English is the first or home language generally use writer responsible styles, and what Matthew McCall calls in his book, Writing Across Cultures, which I've cited here at the end as in one of our sources, and I'll talk more about that when we get there, as preferring a seamless exchange from beginning to the end of one's work. And again, it's that parallel progression we're talking about here. Reader responsible writing cultures, on the other hand, the responsibility is on the reader to interpret what the writer was trying to say. And so this is where many of our international students struggle then when they're sent to United States colleges or colleges that use the writer responsible style, because suddenly they have to switch from making it the reader's job to making it the writer's job, or making it their own job. And so they're moving away from a more detailed and ornate style of academic writing, usually hinting at but not explicitly stating a thesis, especially not till the end of the paper. There's more often theory involved rather than actual action or practice. And they'll write sequentially, providing a lot of rich detail surrounding the topic that sometimes to readers from a writer responsible culture will seem tangential or disjointed and uninteresting to their readers. So often the bias on these writers is that their work is too poetic or unfocused. And we'll see that a lot with writers that come into the Kenyon Writing Center and to the other writing centers at which I've worked. But in reality, it's just coming from a different writing style background. It's also unusual to see any citation style with this cultural writing form. And so another thing that we get, or another bias that we get, is that these writers are plagiarizing. But in reality, it's just not a done practice where they're coming from. And so in the notes section of this slide, I've linked 2 wonderful resources that I really enjoy using for all my students, writer and reader responsible backgrounds, when they choose to self-identify. And if they don't identify, it's great either way. For all my students on citation styles. One is from the Yale Center for Teaching and Learning, and one is from SUNY Brockport's library, which they just updated, I think, the 22nd of May. So that was a well-timed thing for us. But they're great resources on sort of breaking down the basics of writing citation styles. Kenyon's Writing Center also does offer writing citation workshops and class visits. And we do, in fact, have on our website Chicago style APA and MLA citation style guidelines. But these go into a little more detail even than ours. There's ASA involved as well, which is the American Sociological Association, for those who may not be familiar. That's the type I'm referring to. There may be other ASAs out there. All right. Does anybody have any questions so far? I just want to check the chat and make sure there's nothing I need to respond to so far. It looks okay. Anybody have any questions? And again, I'll share Matt McCool's text at the end here. I taught a class on it one semester, and it was really mind opening for my students that were in that class. It was a first-year composition class at a small liberal arts college in Illinois. It was really interesting to see how the students responded to that text. Okay. Okay, awesome. Thank you. All right. So examples from reader responsible cultures are the cultures like Asiatic cultures, letting readers make their own conclusions as they read a text. Again, so we'll see a lot of our students from China sent to the Writing Center because their professors feel like their texts are unclear or disjointed, or maybe they didn't understand the prompt, when in reality, there's just a breakdown between what they understood the prompt to be asking them to do from a cultural standpoint and what they actually did. They do understand the prompt. They have responded to the prompt in the way that they anticipated or thought they were expected to respond to the prompt. It's just not what their professor expected to see. And so it doesn't mean that necessarily we should let that occur, right? That doesn't necessarily mean that it's okay that they responded in a reader responsible style, but it does mean that if our expectation is we want to write a responsible paper, then the onus is on us to explain a little bit about what that formatting might look like. And so usually what I will do is actually take time in class to explain the differences between these two. And so feel free to use anything from these slides that you find might be helpful for you as you work with students from these cultures to sort of engage and talk about the differences. Again, though, to note, as I work with my ELL students, as I work with our ELL tutors, they always caution, right, that these are not black and white. These differences are not the only differences. These differences are not always true across all cultures that are identified as reader responsible or as writer responsible, but these are good starting points for having a conversation with your student, letting them know you're interested and that you care about helping them achieve at the United States collegiate level. Slavic cultures also often use reader responsible writing, particularly in the use of different constructions that offer a little bit more detail. I had a Russian tutor at my previous university who was really excellent at explaining this. And so things that she would do are instead of saying things like the same, she would say not different in her writing. And she was also in some of my classes. And so she would explain to me that this isn't something that she was doing to add more to a text or to engage in sort of that rhetoric of BS to get to a word count or a page length that we sometimes worry students do, but rather it was because that was a verb construction with which she was familiar, or a phrase construction with which she was familiar. And so we might be tempted to tell a reader that, you know, these are negative things, or these are things that look problematic in some way. But asking them why they're doing them can be really beneficial to us, and sort of engaging with the writer about what might be the reason for doing them is helpful. So I just wondered if anybody had any ideas about what we might be tempted to tell a reader who brings in work with these negative constructions, or any other sort of reader responsible things, or what you have told yeah, I see that. Perfect, Alex. My wife's Russian students say not terrible. Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. There's plenty of things that we see. So what might we be tempted to tell? Or are there other examples that y'all have picked up on that you've noticed when now thinking about sort of these reader and writer responsible culture things that anybody wants to share? McNeil asks about, I'm so curious about the parallels between cultural writing styles and philosophical or sociological approach. That's a bigger question that we could probably address here. Unfortunately, yes. But I promise that the resources that I'm going to recommend do a great job of sharing some of that. One of my favorites is a video series. It's outdated, and a dream of mine is to make a new video series of it, an updated, more modern video series. But there is a great Writing Across Borders, it's called, and I link it at the end of this slideshow, talking about it and actually getting that international student perspective, so you don't just hear from a white writer responsible woman. It's really wonderful. Yeah, absolutely, Ashley. I agree. I would have loved to know this before I had to read anything from another another culture besides my own. Yeah, Romance language speakers are often lumped in with our reader responsible writers. Unfortunately, it's not accurate. Yeah, Joe, I keep trying not to put the pressure on our ELL students, but I keep hoping that one of the ELL tutors will take me up on it. So we'll see what happens. But yeah. So the Romance languages sort of fall under it. Kaplan is the initial person who sort of started this whole train, and they use some problematic language in their article. He uses some problematic language in his article, and so I hesitate to show it, but his sort of construction is similar. One of the things that we see a lot with, again, the sort of Romance language is that waiting to state the thesis till the end, right? That idea of working our way toward the thesis instead of right up front bluntly stating our thesis and then going through proving why that is our thesis. And so it's interesting when students come to the United States. There's a great example in the Writing Cross Borders video of a student whose friends then accuse him of being rude later on because he's taken so much to the writer responsible style that when he sends emails to his friends, he just jumps right in to asking a question about when an event is without saying, how are you doing? What's going on? Here's this, giving them updates about his life first. He jumps right in and they actually accuse him of being rude and ask if he's mad at them, right? Because he's sort of almost forgotten his own writing style. He's been so indoctrinated, for lack of a better term, in a new writing style. So yeah, absolutely. Yes, I would love to do it, but again, I don't want to put undue pressure on our international tutors. I know for a fact that there are a couple that are interested in it though. Yeah. Absolutely. Kate hits on a wonderful point. I also imagine this might be very confusing if the student is instructed to change their language by the tutors from not different to same, but then they try writing in the sciences where not different is actually often preferred to same for the sake of linguistic precision and not overstating conclusions. Absolutely. Right. That's a whole additional layer that we have to think about. And the same goes for professors too, right? Like if a student is going to an English class where they're told to get rid of those negative constructions, and then they show up for their bio class later that day and they're told to write in those negative constructions, then they come to the writing center and they're told a third thing or told, one thing per paper, that can be really frustrating and stressful for them. So even just having sort of this experience to rely on as we teach can be really helpful for just even empathizing with them. Yeah, I like that. I noticed a change about the writing style. I agree, Ashley. I try to get across to the point as quickly as possible in my emails, but now I'm so conscious of it ever since Tosin's writing center. Scientific writing internationally also does differ in these ways. Yeah, not always again, because right, these ways are just a starting point, but yes, there is still a lot of conclusion reaching that's done differently. My sister's actually a scientist who works for NASA, and so she works with a lot of different scientists from all over the world, most especially France and Russia, which are really distinct and different, though not Russia so much anymore. And she absolutely experiences this regularly, and she's fortunately fluent in those languages, but it's still a really interesting thing to experience sort of those differences in the ways in which conclusions are reached and statements are made, and sort of even just the way that socialization is done in terms of getting those connections made. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, it's mind-blowing. It is the first time I encountered this, and the first time, again, I shared it with a class of students. It was really fascinating. Yeah, I would imagine that it does. My understanding is that a lot of peer review could benefit from this knowledge that it doesn't necessarily always get. I will say that, and I would say that for journals across cultures. Yeah. So just a comparison for those of you who maybe want to see them side by side. I'm a visual person, so I like to see them laid out. Writer responsible is more often considered succinct and to the points, focusing on practical language and expecting the writer to make all the connections for the reader. The burden of communication then is on the writer. Whereas reader responsible is more often using intricate and detailed language, theoretical language. You may see a little bit more passive voice as well in reader responsible, though not always necessarily, which is a whole nother issue, right? Depending on scientific versus more humanities-based writing. And expects the reader to make deductions about the writer's points. So the burden of communication is on the reader. Did the reader understand what the writer was trying to say? These are, again, not the only writing cultures, and there are many writing cultures impacted by practices like genocide and institutionalized racism that have historically been devalued despite having their own rich tradition. And I do want to just shout out really quick to two of my favorite writing sources that address this most directly. Dr. Vershawn Ashanti Young, or Dr. Vase, Should Writers Use Their Own English, about AAVE, or African American Vernacular English, also called Ebonics, is an excellent article that I always make our Writing Center tutors read. Written totally in AAVE, or African American Vernacular English, that addresses the ways in which there are, again, grammatical structures and expectations that go into place. It's beyond the scope of this presentation to go into more detail about that, but I would be remiss if I didn't mention it. And then also Dr. Liscott's wonderful TEDx talk on sort of the importance. I forget what she called it. Let me see. I have it written down here. I don't have it written down, but it's a wonderful talk, and I have linked it in the notes section of the slide. Again, also about sort of the history of AAVE, or African American Vernacular English. So I think, yeah. And so I think as we often tell students, and this is the point I like to end this part with, as we often tell students to write how they speak, we have to take into account the ways in which that might not be a fair statement to make. How would you say it? Sometimes has a lot behind it that might not always be fair. It might seem like a really approachable way to say things, and in fact, I am guilty of still saying it, even though I know I shouldn't. But in reality, it's not always the most approachable thing to say, because the way they say it may not be what would be considered appropriate or academic, especially using sort of this writer responsible cultural lens. Yeah. Oh, that's wonderful. I think that's a good thing to hear, Helen. I hope it's a positive thing. I hope it's a good experience you're having. So I want to look at an example of a reader responsible essay. I decided consciously not to use any of the ones that our students did offer to us, just in case there were any professors who had those students in class. I didn't want them to feel like they were being called out if they had graded those papers in a different way than the way that we talk about them, or if they had felt like they were maybe being targeted or thought that they or wish they had done things differently. So I picked essays that I found online of English language learners. There are many out there instead, because I thought that way no professors here would feel like they were being, these were willingly shared by professors, as opposed to being maybe unfair targeting of professors. So as you read it, and I'll share the link in a minute, I want you to consider what sticks out to you as differing from or similar to your expectations of student writing. I want you to think about what you would encourage a student to work on in light of what we've just discussed, and what specifically you could point to in the essay that you appreciate about what the student is writing. So what do you think the student is doing well? I was going to say we'll discuss in small groups, but there aren't that many of us, so I think we can still discuss in the large room. I don't think we need to do breakout rooms for this many of us, but does anybody feel they'd prefer breakout rooms? Yeah. If there's time, I will absolutely talk about that, Kate. And if there's not time, I will share some of the materials we use. That's a great question, Ashley. Does this make writer responsible writing cultures lazier than reader responsible? Is that why kids are always moaning and groaning about poetry? I feel like this affects the culture in the science classroom too. I feel like students often want everything spelled out for them, but a lot of work has to be put on them to make their own connections. I think my understanding of that from the reading I've done has more to do with their fear of getting it wrong, their fear of there still only being one right answer, even in something like writing poetry. And sometimes that's tied to there only being one right answer in other settings. Sometimes that's tied to their own personal mindset or anxieties. about education that are beyond things like right or responsible, but there's probably also room for it to be something that students across cultures can be lazy, right? It doesn't matter if you're right or read or responsible or another culture or a blend of these cultures. There are times when certain classes just get more of your attention than others, or certain classes pique your interest more than others. So I think it comes down to a mix of things, I would say, from everything I've read. But a lot of it comes back to the anxieties about, am I getting it right? And that seems to have been, from everything I've read. I'm doing a book review of a book that came out about writing post-pandemic that seems to have been heightened by the pandemic, and not feeling like you're getting that much FaceTime with your professors to have them look over your things in the same way. Yeah, good question. The essay, the book I'm talking about? What essay? Oh yeah, yeah, yeah. So are there other questions first? The link is also in the slide deck you all were sent. Are there other questions first though? Okay, cool. All right. Let me grab that link real quick for y'all.
I got you.
Thank you. All right. And so it's the first example. There are other examples on this that we'll get to, but this is the first example. And it's 9:33 now, so let's meet back. Let's take 10 minutes, see where everyone is, and then if we need more time, we'll take more time. So we'll meet back 9:43. All right. So Kate just asked me if there was a prompt given with these essays. The prompt was to write a rhetorical analysis of the necklace. So I've put that in, pardon me, the chat, just for those of you who are wondering if that would change your viewpoints at all, or give you any additional context. Great question. Yeah. All right. Does anybody want to share any of the things they picked up on, or any of the things they wanted to respond to? You can type it in the chat, or you can holler at me if you want to. That's great as well. Yeah, there is absolutely, Kate, thank you. Yes, there's a link below the essay that you can get the prompt from, as well as the second essay. Great. Yeah. Um Excellent. So the student gave us a new perspective, right? Oops, sorry, my typing isn't going to work. Good, very good. Other things that y'all picked up on. Um uh yeah. Um keep going. Yeah. I'll fix spelling errors at the end. Yeah, great. Okay, I have to fix that one. Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah. Very good. Very good. Other things that y'all, did I miss anything? Um, yeah. Yeah, excellent. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, yeah, very good. Very good. Anything else that y'all picked up on? I'm glad somebody mentioned the thesis. That was one of the things that struck out to me right away when I read this one. Yeah, I'm trying to think if there's anything else. I also agreed about the analysis and the evidence of the text, sort of the textual detail. Yeah. So do you feel like, and this is the question I like to ask because we do a similar exercise with the tutors in our staff meetings every semester. Do you feel like knowing about reader responsible culture, and there's no right answer here, it's a genuine question. Um, but do you feel like doing activities like this or understanding a little bit more about it made you look more favorably at the students writing, knowing a little bit more about maybe the background they might have been coming from? Phrased another way, does it help to understand reader responsible culture as you grade something or as you look at something for the not as you grade, let me go back, as you look at an essay from a student for the first time? What do y'all think? I can type it here too. Yeah, yeah. That's hilarious. Yeah. Yes, I agree. Yeah. Yeah. Absolutely. I think it gives us a great way to frame comments, and that really ties into what we're going to talk about next. So I think with that segue, if there are no questions, we will move on. But let me fix I minimize this so I could see what I was doing. Ooh, too much, too much. Um, yeah. Yes, and I agree. I agree, David. I think that's exactly what it was, is a reader responsible writer attempting to conform to writer responsible standards, which is, I think, the best of all possible examples, really, because it's not the ones that I have that are too writer responsible, too reader responsible, are not necessarily as beneficial. This was the best example I came across by far for really producing conversation, I think. Excellent, excellent. So I do want to share just a couple things. I surveyed our tutors, and some of our tutors are from reader responsible backgrounds, as I've mentioned before. And I asked them, what do you want professors to know, or what do you want academic professionals to know? I abbreviated it to professors for the sake of aesthetics, to be completely honest. And then I also, like I mentioned, I'm reading this book that I will share at the end about global voices in the writing center. And so I just wanted to share a couple ideas about what reader responsible writers and tutors both, and tutors more generally too, want their professors to know. So first, this one comes from I'm going to forget who, Wednesday Afternoons of Words on the Importance of Tutoring and Mentoring for the International Student Writer. And he says, coming up with a thesis is hard for me, an international student, not only because of the language barrier, but the challenge of grasping the central idea of a whole academic paper into one sentence that I believe a lot of students were struggling with as well. However, these two reasons together required much more effort and time for me to reach the same level as my peers who grew up in the United States. I thought that was really fascinating and profound, frankly. This writer, this one comes from, I believe it's called The Tenderest Revenge, and it's about writer who becomes a tutor after a poor tutoring experience, from a tutee to a tutor. Says an English major from a non-Anglo-Saxon cultural background, I had learned the concept of a thesis statement in English academic writing seminars, but I was often unable to formulate one, either because I was more used to presenting my reasoning before I came to a definite conclusion or argument. This seems to come from a different rhetoric tradition, or because I simply lacked enough conceptual knowledge and a solid basis in the field. I thought that was fascinating too. And this is a great time for me to I would tell a writer like this, you can change your thesis, right? It's a working thesis. You don't have to stay with the same thesis the whole time you're writing your paper. This one comes from a tutor. This one says, many of the ELL students who visit me at the Writing Center express some frustration with how their professors treat them because of their writing skills. I've had some say that professors treat them as if they are less intelligent because things like grammatical errors and sentence structure issues make their work more difficult to read. While writing well is important, I think it breaks down students' self-esteem when professors underestimate them because of their struggles with writing English. And then this tutor had a long opinion, shared, whoops, hang on, I gotta minimize. I have sometimes worked with ELL writers who've been sent to the Writing Center by their professors, and they say they want me to, quote, just fix the grammar in their writing. I wish faculty and staff, when they advise ELL writers to come to the Writing Center, would phrase their advice less as this is a problem that you need to fix, and more as the Writing Center can help you with the ongoing process of becoming a more fluent writer and thinker in English. Too often, I think these writers are made to feel ashamed, and I want them to understand that the goal is not just to fix their technical errors, but to help them more ably express themselves in their writing. And I thought these were really just beautiful sort of snippets of longer discussions that the tutors and I have been having. When I started at Kenyon, my goal was to ask the tutors what they wanted to see in the Writing Center. And the number one the number one thing they wanted to see was more support for English language learners, or formerly known as English as a second language. We tend to go away from that term nowadays because it implies English sort of gets the priority over all other languages. It implies that writers, it kind of leaves out the multilingual writers that may be speaking many home languages as well. So we've moved to ELL or NNS, non-native speakers. And so this is coming from a year of working with our writers and then developing a statement on diversity, equity, and inclusion in our writing center, on sort of helping all of our peers. So one of the things we then asked ourselves is, how do we assist writers coming from a variety of writing backgrounds? And to do that, we use what writing centers call valued practices that allow us to adapt to varying student needs based on our growing knowledge of them. So the more often we see a student in the writing center, the more we can adapt. We use the term valued practices instead of best practices because best implies there's one correct or right way of doing things, whereas valued practices allows us to shift and change and use some practices sometimes and different practices other times. This all comes from R. Mark Hall's Writing Center's sort of manifesto on valued practices and building a culture of observation in a writing center. And so I'll go into each one in detail, but the 5 valued practices that the tutors and I have really started to see as valuable both in writing center and in classroom spaces. So there are many more than these, but these are the ones we see that can work in both spaces, are to understand different writing traditions, which we've now done, to grade only on grammatical structures you've taken time to teach in class, and I'll talk more about what I mean by that, to use comments effectively, to have some go-to advice you can use during office hours or conferences, and then to embrace campus resources, which can offer additional support to your writers. Yeah. And we'll talk more about this as we go along too. Okay. All right. So the valued practice number 1, to understand different writing traditions. It can be helpful to take a survey of your students at the beginning of the semester to find out what they do and do not feel confident about when it comes to writing. And this is really important for all of your students, right? And I want to stress that all these practices are just as useful or almost as useful for our international students as for our non-international students, and that many of our students, we're not always going to know necessarily what their writing or their first or home languages are. And so it's a good practice to not make any assumptions based on what we may think about our writers, but rather to just engage with them holistically. And so what I do is I share a survey, and I'll share it with you all in a minute. And I look for trends based on my students' answers, and I use those trends to guide sort of the time that I devote in class to teaching writing. So let's look at that sample survey. It's on the same document that Joe shared with you all earlier. And then I'll read your questions in a minute that y'all are sharing in the chat, but let me pull up, hang on. My screen won't let me won't let me minimize, pardon. I'm reading the wrong thing. So again, this is a survey I share with any class I teach, even the non-writing center classes. It's example 2 down here. This one is taken from the English Lit class that I teach here at Kenyon, but it is not just limited to that English Lit class. It's also not just limited to my time teaching at Kenyon. I've used it pretty much everywhere I've taught for the last, I don't know, 10 years, I would say, since I started doing writing center work. And then I'll share it again in the chat once I find where the chat disappeared to on me. I can't find it. Joe, can you share it in the chat? Share this link in the chat again, because I cannot, for some reason. Now I got it. Here, I got it. Oh, thank you. Okay. So if you want to take, it's 9:57 now. If you want to take just 5 minutes to look over the survey, it's nothing too detailed. I'll read your questions. Yeah, absolutely. I'll read your questions and comments and see if I can respond to any of them. So it's 9:57 now. We'll regroup at 10:02. Awesome. All right. So I will, Kate asked a question in the chat about are the writing processes different between these two cultures? And so I'm going to answer that question with a story that you might notice in the notes section. I wrote a story about Kenyon students in the library. So when I first came to Kenyon, and this is a story that could be told at any college I've been to, we had a great session with some of our international students in the library, and one of the librarians was talking about our wonderful databases, and the students were paying attention but looking mildly disinterested is a strong word, but mildly like, okay, I'm not sure why I'm going to need this information is probably a better way of describing their facial expressions. And so I asked, have any of you ever had to use an outside source for your essays? Have you ever had to go and find an internet source? And 201, they said no, right? And so right there is a very distinct difference that we'll see from many of our international writers across cultures, is that if there are outside sources that are expected to be used, they're provided by the professor. And that happens for a variety of reasons across cultures. There's a great example in Writing Cross Borders of a student from, I want to say, Malawi, who is told what to write about and that you can't critique the government. That is not a thing that's done. And so they're only given pro-government sources to use in their papers. And so when she comes to the United States and is told to critique a government program for cafeteria food, like a lunch program at a local grade school, she cannot do it, right? The struggle to write that paper is exponentially increased by her inability and discomfort with critiquing the government, because that's just not something done in her culture. And so right there is a huge distinct difference in writing process that can further be compacted by things like then having the assumption that they know how to do things like find their own sources. But things like procrastination exist across cultures, right? There is no doubt that there are students everywhere who procrastinate in a variety of different ways. Resistance to or enjoyment of assignments is going to vary across cultures too, right? There are some things that we all like to write more than others, which is why questions like number 7 for me are really interesting to ask. Because it gives me a little bit of guidance and also lets me play with the smaller writing assignments I do in class as well as the larger ones. Eric asked, do I let them do graphic essays? And the answer is yes. I have students every year that hand in paintings, even I have some of them hanging in my office. And they have to do reflective. I'm a big proponent of reflective practice. I blame the Jesuits in my PhD program for that. But I do make them do a reflective component with it. But yeah, I love exploring how we take writing to the next level and what that might look like. And so I also teach graphic medicine as part of my course. So it's a natural extension of that, graphic novel medicine. So yeah, long story short, yes, there are differences in writing process, but there are also not differences in writing processes. Yeah, I was hoping there would be connections. I was hoping to get to go to yesterday's workshop, but I had an external review due, and it was it was on a deadline, so I didn't get to go. We were hoping our conclusion sounded better than it did, and it did not. So yes, I think there were absolutely connections though to be drawn between this workshop and yesterday's. Great question. So what else did y'all pick up on, or what other things did y'all note in the sort of the some of you have already shared your comments in the chat. Are there any other questions or any other things you want to share sort of in the chat about this 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 survey? Anything you're curious about? Yeah. Oop, I'm typing on the wrong place, y'all. Yeah. Um, yeah. Yeah, adapting to upper level courses, to be honest, I use pretty much the same thing for my upper level English students and my upper level writing center tutors, which at this university is an English course, but at my previous universities was not, because I also taught a general tutoring course for tutors across disciplines, because I think it's good to take it back to the basics of writing. I think it demystifies and anxieties writing if you can just take it down to its basic components. So I use a very similar structure. Things that I do add are what professors have you written for. That helps me gauge, especially because I work in the writing center and I know what some of the assignments might look like coming from those professors. And, you know, they're my colleagues. I know what they're doing and I like talking to them. That can be helpful. And then it also is helpful when they're tutors, because then we put that in their bios so that students coming in to get help know that they have experience with those professors. But otherwise, I pretty much leave it as is, because there are still things that, you know, when I'm working with seniors in nursing at my last university, for example, they were still struggling with commas placement. Absolutely. Yeah, great question. Great question. Joe, do you have your hand raised?
I do actually. So one of the fun things is surveys always tell us a little bit about the survey taker. So
Yeah.
I noticed things like, to me, the question about what do you think the purpose of a thesis statement is, seems targeted in a way that kind of addresses what we've been talking about for the last hour, that where and how thesis statements are used is a debatable point.
Yeah.
And I wonder if I'd see the same thing if I looked more carefully at the list of grammar tips you might look. I mean, I assume that those are the grammar tips that you felt yourself having to address in the past. So
yes. Oh yeah. Yeah. And some of them are things too that, like, I definitely, did I put it in here? I might not have. There is one that is a pet peeve of mine that I don't even give. I didn't put it in here. I don't even give as an option because I just always teach it, which is unclear demonstrative pronouns. And it never would have been a pet peeve of mine, except my dissertation director hated it. And so because she drilled into me clear demonstrative pronouns, any student who has ever taken me will still mention the demonstrative pronouns, maybe looking a little more scarred than I would appreciate them looking. But yeah, yeah, I don't even give them an option.
Syllabus quizzes where, you know, you give the students a quiz on the syllabus, and what those invariably tell you are what ticks the professor off most. Can you, and like people will say, can you give me a good one? I'm like, no, you should ask about what's going to make you mad when it happens. Exactly. Oh, yeah. Yes. Yeah, absolutely, Helen. You know, students being fixated on citation styles, but yeah, they don't know what they don't know. And it's strange to me what they don't know, right? Because even just grading my tutors, you know, just finishing grading my tutors' final essays not that long ago,
you know, the even the upper level, the juniors that have been doing this citation style for at least a full really year, the things they don't know about, like, you know, not putting the full name of the author if they're doing APA, like, mind-blowing to me, right? But it maybe isn't necessary, right? Yeah. Ooh, I like that idea. What have others told you are some of the strengths of your writing? That can be really useful. I have not, I will safely confess to you all that I have not paid any attention to any grammatical things and am the number one worst offender. My mother loves to correct my grammar and then talk about how aren't you supposed to be a writing center director? It's really her most endearing quality. Yeah, awesome. All right, I don't want to belabor this one too long. But please keep comments coming, and if questions coming, and again, like I said too, I am always here for more, to answer more questions if you think of things after the fact. Yeah. So valued practice number 2 is one of my favorites because it's a sneaky secret time saver, but it makes you look really good to your students in my experience. Grade only on grammar you've taken time to teach in class. It's frustrating for students who have not had the same educational opportunities, maybe as you or maybe as others in the class. And it helps if we can share our wisdom with them instead of holding them to a standard that's maybe unrealistic or unfair. It also cuts down on your grading time, which is the real bonus here. You don't have to waste time looking at every single misplaced comma or every single, misspelled word. You just look at commas in one set of papers, and in the next set of papers, you look at demonstrative pronouns, and in the next set of papers, you look at, if contractions are a pet peeve of yours, you look at those, right? And so that way you're not spending a ton of time stressing yourselves out, but you're also giving your students an opportunity to really learn a concept holistically and spend time learning that concept and spend time putting that concept into practice and really focusing on it instead of trying to make them do everything all at once. I do have a solution though if you're an everything all at once person, so don't worry, we'll get there. A couple of ways you can go about this. Our Writing Center on YouTube has a ton of grammar videos that you can just show your students so that you don't even have to teach them the grammar. You can just plop in the video. Owlet Purdue also has a wonderful grammar exercises. I've linked both of those there. And then ask your peers and your Writing Center too. I, for example, here at Kenyon, for any Kenyon faculty or anyone who's listening to this right now, I can send it to you too, have about 70 grammar slides I'll share with anyone who asks for them. It literally covers, I think, maybe all of those topics that are listed in that survey, or close to all of those topics that are listed at that survey. I know there's sentence fragments and commas for sure in there. Don't reinvent the wheel. See who has material out there that you can use. And then only grade on that. Cut down your grading time. And this works well for all your students. But if you're someone who wants to be teaching more grammar rules, if there are different expectations on your students, maybe you're teaching a senior capstone and they really need to have those grammar rules down pat, then error analysis is another option. And I'll explain what it is by looking at example 3 on the handout, because there's just too many steps otherwise. Let me see if I still have copied and pasted the document. I did this time. Okay. So let's go over to the document and I'll actually share my screen this time for error analysis as well. Maybe. Can you all see my screen with the example 3 error analysis?
Yep.
Okay, cool. All right. So there are 2 ways to go about it. One is to read it out loud. You don't have to read it out loud, but it's an option. In the Writing Center, we tend toward reading out loud, but it's also something that can be ableist and is not always equitable to do. So it's an option, but it's not the only way of doing it. If it's larger work, like a 5 to 7 page paper, you might only want to read a couple paragraphs or a page. But if it's a shorter work that's, 1 to 3 pages, you might be able to read the whole thing. It's really up to you and how much time you have. If it's something you're planned to do in class, I'd stick to like a page or 2 paragraphs. If it's something they're coming in for office hours to do, you can adjust your time accordingly to how much time you have available in office hours. Make notes together, if possible, of the issues you see, telling each time you see one. So, for example, I'll usually like abbreviate WC, word choice, comma, and I'll just tally every time I notice something's wrong as I go along and read it. If I don't know what the grammar issue is, but I know it's an issue, I'll honestly write awkward. I'll talk more about why that's a problem long term, but in a couple slides, but it's okay for error analysis. The one or two issues with the most tallies by the time you're done reading are the issues that you want to spend the time with your writer discussing. So, again, whether that's class time, again, whether that's office hours time. If it's class time, what I recommend you all do is actually collect them, tally up what you see the most, and then talk about those in the next class, in the following class, so that you actually have time to prepare a lesson. So that you have them do the error analysis one day in class, and the next day in class, you give the grammar lessons. All right. You want to keep reminding, however you do it, the students of the previous issues that you've worked on. So if you decide that one day you're going to work on word choice, and then the next most common issue you saw was comma placement, so you're going to work on that next, you're going to go work on comma placement, but you want to talk about word choice first and just sort of recap it for them. That's always a really beneficial way to sort of help the students remember and retain what you've learned. So there are a couple of grammatical structures that, what am I trying to say? That most common occur. And so the example I'm going to show you has these ones as sort of a good starting point. But I also want to remind you that you can encourage your students to go to the Writing Center. Most writing centers will help your students with these grammatical structures, but it isn't all that writing centers do, right? And that's an important point we all try to make, is that we're not here for grammar help. Grammar help is not our number one priority, but we are more than happy to help with grammar. And so at Kenyon anyway, all of our tutors have been trained to do error analysis with writers, and they will continue to be trained whether or not they want to be in subsequent staff meetings. We usually do at least one a year on error analysis. I am okay with Grammarly. I think it's a good option. I think it's especially the free option. I personally wouldn't pay for it, but to each their own. I think I don't have the problems with AI that some people do. I'm not genuinely worried about it. I don't think you're ever going to replace the real and true human connection. I will say what my grandma said about many things about AI. It's a good servant, but a poor master, in terms of it can be a very useful tool, but it isn't the only tool a student should have in their toolbox. So I think Grammarly is a good starting point, but I don't think it's the end point, right? And so I'd encourage students to use Grammarly in addition to things like talking to their professors during office hours, going to the Writing Center, and so forth, using our YouTube videos and the OWL grammar exercises. Yeah, great question. So I'm not going to teach you all these grammatical structures, but I encourage you to read them if you're not sure about them. But this is what I would generally do with my class. This is generally what I would do with my tutors as well. This is in fact an exercise I think that I gave 2 tutors. I was taught error analysis as a tutor, and I've used it as a professor to great success. Things to note about error analysis that I think are really important. It seems to help students more quickly get the handle of correcting their own errors, which is really beautiful. And it also helps me get a little bit more insight early on into what my students are writing, so I can catch larger issues as well. So if there are things like where I can tell that they haven't understood the prompt, it gives me a chance to see that in real time. So to do error analysis, what you do is you look for the issues that I've outlined in the bullets here: article missing or misused, a spelling error, a subject-verb agreement misuse. And then if there's time, if you want to, look for places where they've misused count and non-count nouns. You count them all out based on this little passage here that begins with, oops, when entering the door at lose. And then you see which ones you've noticed the most. And those are the issues you address first with the student. Do y'all feel like trying it? Do you want to try it? Does error analysis seem like something that interests y'all? Oops, Zoom. Sorry. What do y'all think? Okay, cool. Let's try it. All right, so go ahead and take it. It's 10:20. Let's just take 5 minutes to look at this paragraph. Whatever you get to, see how many times you notice each of these errors. So how many times you notice an article missing or misused? How many times do you notice a spelling error? How many times do you notice a misconnected subject and verb agreement? And if you have time, how many times do you notice count and non-count nouns? And if you have questions, I'm here to answer them. And then we'll talk about what issue you notice most personally. And again, there's no necessarily right answer to which issue you tackle first, but it can help your students no matter what. This is also where if you have a sample of student writing that you want to look at, this is also a good place to look at it as well if you'd rather, to think about error analysis in that regard. You can look at the larger paragraph, the larger essay we looked at, again keeping in mind that it's a take-home essay or a in-class essay, so the spell check options are not going to be the same as they were for this student who just had to write a paragraph for class, but was allowed to type and submit it on a word processor like Google Docs, Word, those types of things that actually had the spell check option. All right. So now I'm just curious, does anybody, so first I shared in the chat, the link to all my grammar slides for y'all. If you want to use them, feel free. I think there are like 8 maybe lessons on different grammar ideas. And then there's also something on, paragraph structure in there that I love called the meal plan about main idea, evidence, analysis, and links. May make you hungry though. But there's some great resources in there. Feel free to use them. They're linked there for you, the Google Slides. But I'm curious, does anybody lean more towards one idea or the other, towards using error analysis or using sort of this idea of only grading on one grammar thing at a time with your students? What appeals to you more? Yeah, sure. There are benefits and drawbacks to both, right? So the benefit to error analysis, and it's sort of discussed on that handout that y'all had here, is there are places that students can pick up on their own errors more quickly, especially with that repetition, that reiteration of issues. Error analysis does work just as well for native English speakers as non-native speakers. I used it to great effect with a history grad student who was told they needed to make their writing sound, quote unquote, more academic at one of my previous institutions. And we found that it worked really well for her to actually look at the places where she maybe slipped into more familiar language, or language where she maybe got less was less likely to cite because she knew the material so well that she like had skipped a citation or something like that. So we caught all manner of things with her error analysis. And I've also used it with grad and undergrad students who are non-native speakers who maybe need more help with something like an indefinite or definite article. And so it's been really useful for a variety of students I've worked with. But the grading only on one thing at a time has also had really wonderful benefits. It's made for clear rubrics. It's also made for really nice and clear expectations from my students. And I was told a long time ago, and it's stuck with me since, really to grade on grammar you haven't taught can be a reaffirmation of institutionalized racism, unintentionally or otherwise. Because if we're grading on grammar we haven't taught, we are unintentionally expecting our students to have the same lived experiences as each other and perhaps as ourselves, and that's not always the case. And so we have to be careful about how we grade on grammar. Yeah, in a one-on-one situation, kind of have to go over the errors, but you should only go grade over those you emphasize in class. I agree. That's my go-to. It's easy. What I do, and I will say this, as I teach a lesson, I do grade on it in the subsequent papers as well. So let's say the first paper, they're only getting graded on demonstrative pronouns. The second paper, they're getting graded on demonstrative pronouns and commas, because you have to keep reinforcing the behavior, right? And so it's nice for me because it builds up what I remember I need to grade them on. But it also builds up sort of that, it reinforces for me that I need to reinforce the lessons I'm teaching them. Yeah, but error analysis is less overwhelming in some ways. And I think, especially if you make the students take part in it, if you make it part of a class activity, it can be really beneficial to have them start thinking about that writing process and about why it's important to not write papers the night before, because it shows them how to do part of that editing process. If they don't write their paper the night before, it also helps in a day and age when we're really worried about Chat GPT and stuff, because it makes, again, their papers be something that is more their own writing. It is more their own efforts put into their paper. It is something that, again, they're not just doing the night before or sending to a chatbot to do the night before. It's at least something they're putting some other effort and writing effort into. Yeah. Interesting. That's interesting. I like that, writing with an accent. Yes. Yeah. Yes, I that's an interesting way of looking at it too, Helen. I think that's always an option as well, right? What is the level at which meaning is no longer clear? Yeah. Beautiful, beautiful. Um, yeah. Yeah, many would say they don't have time to teach grammar in class. That's when I would encourage the students, that's when I would encourage those faculty to send students to the writing center along with the whole paper, right? And to ask the students to ask the tutor that in addition to looking at the paper, they look at the grammar of the paper as well. That's when I would encourage that faculty to encourage the students to look at things like the OWL at Purdue, to look at things like YouTube for videos on grammar. If you're noticing trends in grammar, you may not have time to teach it in class, but you can at least point the students to resources they can use outside of class. It's a great question. And I'll talk about a couple of those. It's a great question, Elaine. Yeah. Awesome. All righty. I'm going to skip this slide because I didn't make notes, but we did talk about them. So valued practice number 3 is using comments effectively. And this is sort of the one I promised that I would get back to, that I promised the tutors I would talk about, and also promised some of my students I would talk about, some of my English language learners that I've worked with. Students regularly come to the Writing Center for help incorporating professor comments. It can be difficult, though, when the professor has written one word like awkward. And I always think of Brooklyn Nine-Nine here, where Captain Holt is working with one of his police officers, and he says, there are a couple places where your meaning was unclear. I marked them awk for awkward. It was great in theory, but it becomes really difficult for our English language learners who need more context. But it also becomes difficult for our native English speakers who need more context, right? What exactly is awkward? What part of the sentence is awkward? Some professors at least underline, which is helpful, or highlight or point an arrow. That can be a little bit more, but one word comments really are difficult for students. So the best thing you can do is eliminate one word comments. If the same problem does continue to crop up, you can start abbreviating. I do this so often, especially with things like demonstrative pronouns. I explain the first time what I mean, and then every subsequent time I write DP. If the comments are getting overwhelming, I start numbering them, and I will be like, go back to comment number 1, see comment number 1. And that way, at least theoretically, if the students read the comments, which there are conflicting reports on whether or not they do, then they will know what they're doing, but also then the tutor will know where to look as well, or then the subsequent person who looks at that paper will know where to look as well. I just want to share some interesting statistics, which I thought were about our writing center this year. We just got new tracking software, and approximately 11% of our writers overall, when we started tracking in September, wanted help with either understanding the prompt or rubric or their professor's comments. When we look only at writers who identify a language other than English as their first or home language, that number increases to 16.5%, which is, a 5.5% jump. Not a huge jump, but significant enough to make it noteworthy, I think, because it's something that we have to think about and keep our eyes on as we work with our students from across cultures and disciplines. Yeah, yikes. Um, uh, that's a great question. Um, Right. I like that idea too. Helen mentions, just want to point out about ethos and credibility in terms of correctness. That's an interesting way of looking at it. Susan asks, what's a better approach than staying till 1 a.m. to help a student? Honestly, that's when I would email the professor and say, hey, the student came to me, we worked on these things for an hour. If you want the student to work with me more, then you either need to send them to me sooner. Now, assuming that the student came as soon as a professor sent her, which is always a possibility that they did not, or, you need to be happy with the hour of work we put in today. Do not do more than you can. My grandmother always said, do what you can, when you can, and that's all you can. I have no problems. And it's something I finally learned after lots of soul searching, telling a student, I have an hour to work with you today. We will get what we can done in that hour. And then you need to schedule a follow-up with me. But it is very difficult to do, right? It is not easy to do. Yeah, I'm going to talk about that in a minute, David. Excellent question. So consider accessibility too. Record your comments and enunciate. Remember, though, this is the number one request I had for my ELL writers again. Enunciate and speak slowly, both things which I am sometimes rubbish at. This method does work really well for you if you're sick of staring at a screen or your hands hurt from writing. I have arthritis, so every so often I need to take a breather from writing, but I hate grading on a screen, so I have to have that printout writing, and recording comments can help a lot with that. And I'm wondering, the same thing as David, has anyone else found an additional method particularly effective in writing or adding comments? And or have you used audio comments? Have you found a particular software or modality that's is great for commenting on student papers? What are y'all working with here? David, yeah.
Yeah, at the risk of self-promotion here, I'm actually doing a little presentation on this tomorrow, screencasting, which is a method that I really like and that I found to be pretty efficient as well.
Nope, I was hoping you would do that. That's perfect. Anybody else? Anything you found or anything else y'all can think of and if not, you should go to David. David, when is your presentation? Can you remind us all?
Tomorrow morning. It's the first session tomorrow morning.
Always, we are about that self-promotion here. Yeah. Other things. Yeah.
I do all of my students' writing in Brightspace, which is our LMS. Short papers, I just use, I do a lot of short, low stakes writing that just gets a rubric and maybe a sentence. And then longer papers now I don't have many ELL writers. I have largely native speakers. But generally speaking, for full length, for more formal writing and longer papers, I use audio feedback. Supplemented, there's a rubric function right in Brightspace that I use. And if I need to, there's little stickies and other annotation tools that I can use, but I try not to overwhelm with comments. One thing I like on the teacher end about using audio comments is it forces me to be really selective. When I'm writing comments, I'm just like, oh, right there, here, so consider this, consider that. But when I'm giving audio comments, I really have to say, okay, what are the most urgent things? And do that. And the other thing is that the students report that it feels friendlier than ink on a page.
Helen, is the recorder for those audio comments built into the LMS?
It is built into the LMS in Brightspace. I think if it weren't, I would use a screencasting tool. Because I know we had Moodle until very recently, which I know you have, and I don't think Moodle supports that.
I think that's correct. I have seen some. I've seen some things that our Moodle doesn't do that promise that. Rachel, I'm going to look at that. Like I said, the thing that is top of my mind right now seemed to perpetually be in development, and I'm just not going to go there because we don't have development resources. But I may be. We just did an upgrade. There's always new stuff. There's stuff that gets permanent. I do know at Kenyon there are folks who have used. There is an audio. You can give a single audio comment on a paper that is turned in through Turnitin. That opens a whole batch of significant problems that need to be thought about. And I have strong opinions, which I think I don't want to record right now. But I guess I am saying that I do know there are people who like that grading tool for things, including audio comments. Although the flip side of it is that both in that and in Moodle feedback, we've had trouble with students knowing how to find the feedback.
Yes.
And there sometimes needs, if you're doing anything other than probably returning a paper with literal ink on it, the students may need, don't assume that students will find it.
Sorry, I couldn't unmute myself there for a minute. So I responded to a couple comments in the chat, but these are wonderful, excellent options. And yes, there are some additional accessibility issues to consider, and to consider what's best for your students based on what accessibility needs you have in front of you at the time. But there are always good additional options available. So things to consider. And yeah, again, too, consider how well your students know you, because things like I am a laugher. I tend to be a laugher. But that can be really offensive if they don't know you, and culturally as well as just personally, right? Even if it's not culturally. So keep in mind those things as well when you get when you start working with students. Yeah. Value practice number 4, have some go-to advice you can use during office hours or conference time. It's also sometimes useful during grading, especially if you're going for an audio grading. So a couple key times it's good to be prepared. If a student writes something you're struggling to understand, if a student plagiarizes, or if a student doesn't seem to understand an assignment or your expectations. And so I just want to give you some language you can think about using or adapting. So if you're not completely unsure of what they've written, and this is one of the things that tutors and I talk a lot about, you can try saying, I'm not sure what you mean here, and then read the confusing part out loud. That's always a key thing to do. Or even if at times it might not be helpful, at least pointing to it. If a student reading it out loud may not be helpful or may make them feel embarrassed, pointing to it and slowly reading it to yourself as you point to each word can be helpful, because it encourages the student to do the same. Then ask, when you wrote that, what point were you working to make? Avoid words like trying to make, because it implies something that is less positive than working to make, right? You want to acknowledge that they did put effort into it, whereas trying sounds like, you failed. And then if you think, however, you know what they've written, you can say, this part is unclear to me, doing the same thing, reading it out loud again, or pointing to each word in time. I'm not sure what you mean, because what it seems like the meaning to me is, explain what you think it is. Is that the argument you were trying to make, or the point you're trying to make, or the idea you're trying to make? I tend to avoid number 2. I tend to always go with number 1, even if I think I know what they've written, because I've been burned by number 2 once or twice, in terms of I have thought I knew what they were trying to say and I haven't, or they were trying to say something so much more beautiful than what I could have articulated, and I feel like I unnecessarily clipped their voice a little bit. And so sticking with number 1 allows you to get more of their natural voice in there. However, if they're a more resistant writer or they're a more shy student, number 2 can be really helpful for getting conversation going when they feel a little more stuck, or maybe they're not as responsive. The chat disappeared on me again, so if anyone's in the chat, I apologize. I'll look for you in a minute. If you think they've not cited something properly, keep in mind that different cultures have different citation expectations. One of the things that blew my mind when I first learned citation styles is that other cultures look at citation as something you don't need to do, because it's compliment enough that you're using their work in your work, and so you don't need to cite it. They should just be pleased you're using their work. And so keep in mind that it may not be coming from a place of malice, but rather from just a different cultural practice. So things that you might want to think about saying are, the language in this part seems different from your writing elsewhere. Were you using another resource or text when you wrote it? Let's look at that resource really quick, and then you can go into sort of discussing citation. If they answer no, you can ask them about, do you know when to cite sources and how, and talk about, I can help them. Because at the end of the day, if you're not their teacher, if you're someone who's working in a Center for Teaching and Learning or Center for Global Engagement or something like that, you may not have that final say. But if you are their teacher, well then, yeah, it's really important you catch the plagiarism, right? And so either way, I recommend talking about citing sources. That's where the if you are their teacher, the start of the semester survey can sort of catch some of this stuff before it comes up in class. But if you're not their teacher, you don't get to do that start of the semester survey. And so either way, you're going to want to talk to them about how to cite sources. Even if they say no, I think it's a valuable time to talk about citing sources again anyway. All right. And then if you think they've not understood your expectations, things that you can do are pull up the prompt. You can share different notes from class. You can share different notes from previous papers you've given them and explain what you mean, because maybe they didn't understand the comment you made last time. Sometimes I find myself writing the same comment on multiple drafts of a student's paper, and it's like, how have you not gotten this? I have written this 3 times, when in reality, I should be thinking, how can I phrase this differently? And so I've caught myself more and more often, even in class, when I ask a question, asking the question, then saying, phrased another way, and asking it a different way as well. And this can be really helpful for your students who maybe just don't think the same way you do in terms of your own word choice. Things that I like to ask students are, what did you find challenging as you wrote this draft? That helps me as I think about feedback to give them. And then one activity that I love doing is the day I give out the prompt, I have them circle things or highlight things or underline things on the prompt they don't understand. And then I make them go physically up to the board or type into a Google document what those areas are, copy and paste usually into the Google document, if I'm honest. And we talk about them each turn by turn, and it's fairly anonymous. And it lets me at least know that we have addressed some of the biggest issues in the prompt that the students didn't understand. So that's an option too. What are other things you've done when a student has struggled or written something you found confusing or otherwise unclear? And I'm going to minimize real quick so I can find the chat again. Actually, I'm going to stop sharing. The chat disappears for me sometimes when I share. Does anyone have anything they want to share that's been helpful for them when you've had a student write something that you found unclear? Or has something been said to you that you found helpful that helped you clarify something?
Probably the most useful thing that has been said to me personally was in a committee meeting where we were trying to draft the mission statement for the Center for Innovative Pedagogy. And I had written something ornate and detailed and contextual and too long by at least half. And one of our colleagues said to me, "This sentence is a little unclear. What are you trying to say?" And I said it. He said, "Say that." And I found myself using that mentally a lot, and I use it with my colleagues occasionally. What are you trying to say? Say that. That's okay. That conversational reaction is good enough.
I like that. I think that's a great one. Just say that. I tell my students all the time, brevity is the soul of wit, which is something I repeat constantly to myself, right, from Shakespeare. And while they don't always get it, it at least keeps me honest and at least gives me that chance to talk about concise writing with them, right? Yeah. I'm a big fan of reading out loud. The Writing Center tutors, like I said, they do it a lot. I'm a big fan, to be honest. But it's not always, again, accessible or inclusive. But when possible, yes, I am here for that, Eric. I'm with you on that. Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah, I'm a big fan of reflective practice. Again, I blame the Jesuits for that, for that, and I also do blame my Writing Center mentor had us reflect after every conference on what we thought, what strategies we use to tutor writers, and that really, I reflect after every class I teach and every workshop I lead. What went well? What would I change up for next time? Things like that. Yeah. Yeah, I love that. I love that. The immediate reactions and questions are so helpful because it just don't think, react can sometimes be a really beneficial thing, Rachel. That's beautiful. Yeah. I also will just say that when students come in with problematic language, which sometimes happens, the Writing Center's theory is that we don't assume it comes from a place of malice or hate at first. But I do train my tutors in how to deal with things that may be sexist or racist or xenophobic that students have written. So in addition to things that they maybe don't understand, there may be things that they do understand all too well. but the hope is that the writer didn't mean that. And we practice what's called forum theater, which I've linked in that slide on go-to advice for anyone who's interested in sort of that process. It can be really helpful for having audience participation in difficult conversations related to any number of topics about how you address those areas when a student has written something terrible that you understand all too well for the wrong reasons. Yeah. Excellent. Excellent. All right. And then let me see if I can get my screen to share again. Okay. My last suggestion is sorry, it moved away on me, is to embrace campus resources, which can offer additional support to your writers. So if you look at that handout I gave you one more time there, the examples of ELL writing, you'll see the last thing, which is a, hang on, every time I share my screen, the chat disappears. There we go. This time it didn't. You'll see that I have an alphabetized list of campus resources with descriptions. I share this with all of my students, and it's also shared with our Writing Center students. We keep it in our tutors. Our tutors have a Google Drive, and they have access to it in the Google Drive. They also have printed out copies of this and many of our other grammar handouts and our writing handouts more generally. And I do this for two reasons. One, it lets students know they can talk to me about any of these resources. And two, it keeps me up to date on what campus is offering. For Kenyon staff and faculty too, I also offer standardized language that faculty and staff can include in their syllabus or on Moodle or wherever they want without having to develop their own description of our writing center. Many other writing centers and other campus centers do this across campuses. It's not just something unique to Kenyon's Writing Center. Another thing that Kenyon's Writing Center and many other writing centers and campus resource centers do, again, across campuses, is class visits. And so if there is something that you think your students would benefit hearing directly from the horse's mouth, so to speak, have us come in and do that as much as possible. Awesome, Kate. Yeah. So I'm a big fan of having things like the counseling center come in and talk to my students. They can explain it way better than I can. I'm also a big fan of having my tutors do the talking as much as possible in these class visits, because it does seem to demystify and destigmatize the experience a little bit in terms of writing center work if they hear it directly from their peers instead of from me. And then again, use your campus writing center. I can't emphasize it enough. Here at Kenyon, we have everything from course embedded writing liaisons to writing accountability consultants through Kenyon Writes. And we also have a newer program called Conversation Partners for students who want to enhance their English dialoguing skills. These are not programs, again, unique to Kenyon. Many writing centers offer them. I've started them at 2 writing centers of my own, but I've had them at 2 other writing centers I've worked at. And again, faculty, we do class visits, and many writing centers offer similar options. I do want to also share additional resources writing across cultures before I ask for any final questions. As mentioned throughout, Tosin Writing Center's Writing Across Borders video series is absolutely remarkable for getting that true international student perspective on writing expectations, on how writing expectations differ across cultures, and what those experiences with writing expectations are. Matthew McCool's Writing Around the World, A Guide to Writing Across Cultures is both a book and an ebook. Kenyon's library has it in ebook form, so I've linked it there for anyone who has access to Kenyon's library. Student Writing Center Tutors in Their Own Words, Global Voices on Writing Centers and Beyond is also another remarkable book that just came out in 2022. I'm writing a book review on it right now. I really recommend it. I think it's a great one. And then I always have to throw this in there somewhere. If I can sneak it in, I sneak it in. The Conscious Style Guide, which is an excellent online resource for helping students think about cultures and experiences other than and sometimes including their own, addressing accessibility, race, gender, all the types of things that students from across cultures might want to know more about. So how can I help? What other questions might you have? Yeah.
A little bit. This is something that's, kind of on my mind in terms of things that some international students might struggle with, but I've also seen students of particular religious traditions struggle with, which is the individualism of certain kinds of writing that's pretty standard in the US, especially things like graduate school personal statements.
Yes. Oh my goodness. So I missed the first part of your question, but let me just make sure I understand. So talking just a little bit more about how to address sort of the struggles with the individualistic writing assignments across courses. Okay.
And
yeah.
particularly when you get to students who need to do, who want to do things like write a graduate school personal statement that are by definition culturally very, very uncomfortable.
Oh yeah.
For people from some world cultures or even some faith traditions.
Absolutely. Absolutely. The expectation there is really, really trying, right?
Yeah.
And even for some of our students who just feel the pressure, like, gosh, don't I sound like I'm bragging? Yeah. So things that seem to work are multiple drafts, right? We had just constantly drafting, but the biggest thing, and the thing that I work a lot with our international students actually on personal statements, and I'm thinking about one in particular this this past year that I just saw right before I graduated. Don't cut anything. Bring it all in. Bring in that monster draft, right? Write that 15-page personal statement if you need to, but don't let them cut anything till the end. And I think that's the best thing you can do for stuff like that. That's the more personalized and individualistic, because it's so uncomfortable and because it's so self-conscious. They'll eventually get more comfortable the longer they go, but don't cut as you write. Just write, and then at the very end, edit. And that is something I work with pretty consistently, honestly, when I work with our international students on personal statements. It's funny. I'm trying to think if there's ever been a time I haven't had to give that advice. And off the top of my head, I can't think of a time. So my best advice for students working on, there's more individuals like scholarship essays too, the Fulbrights even and stuff like that. Don't cut until the very end. That seems to help because we get to those nuggets of truth then, and then we can pull out themes. And I'm a big fan of the highlighting, color coding themes and pulling it out. But it is difficult. It is absolutely difficult.
Or even things like cover letters for job applications.
Bragging
about yourself like that and saying why you're the greatest applicant for this position is just so culturally not okay.
Yes. Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah. Yeah. It's really difficult, I think, for students to feel, and again, too, I would even say some of our non-international students, it's really difficult for them to feel comfortable sort of bragging about themselves. Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Eric, you asked, do you have resources geared more towards scientific-ish writing? What do you mean exactly?
As opposed to an essay, a formalized thesis, it's just more descriptive of whatever the reading has been or whatever observations they're making about a system or a natural, the world or what have you. Is that clear?
Yeah, I mean, I don't see how. I guess I don't see how this advice wouldn't apply to scientific writing. My advice would still apply in terms of the things like grammar grading and such. I think to think about international students and scientific writing, go back to what we talked about at the beginning, sort of, and the ideas of the notion that, these ideas are still going to apply to international students. This sort of, getting to the point more, what is the word I want? Give me a minute and I'll think of it. It's not coming to me. My mind is racing too. I can't think of what I wanted to say. But sort of the notion. Why don't you rephrase your question? Try again with it.
I do not doubt that everything I've learned here today, and it's been a lot I've learned here today, is going to be helpful for me. And I'm not asking you to change it in any way.
Oh no, yeah, I don't feel that
you have other resources, additional resources?
I see what you're saying for how international students write scientifically.
or any students write scientific.
Yeah. Oh God, yes, I do. Did you get to go to Chris Gillen? I don't know who else was on that presentation, so I feel bad asking just about Chris. But did you get to go to the presentation yesterday with the Science and Nature Writing?
Yes, I did.
Awesome. Okay, so I have a bunch of stuff from working with them. I can send your way if you want to email me. Do you have my email address?
I sure do. I'm at Kenyon, so I'll.
Oh, perfect. Yes, email me. I have a bunch of stuff from working with them, and I will be more than happy to send it to you.
Okay, thank you.
Yes, excellent. Great question. Great question. I get you're saying. It took me a minute. It's the end of the presentation. That's my excuse. Other questions or other things I can help anybody here with? I gotta move from that side because we didn't. Yeah, go for it.
In your role, do you ever need to convince faculty that ELL writers are not deficient?
Yeah. Not at Kenyon so far, knock on wood. I may come a day. I've heard secondhand things from ELL writers, but I've never experienced it firsthand from faculty directly myself. It will come. Nobody's perfect. But yes, absolutely. I have in my time had to do that. And unfortunately it's applied right across various language traditions, right? Again, going back to the AAVE as well and other language traditions like that. Sort of the different Latin English language traditions and things like that as well. Yeah.
Do you just directly address this and say,
yeah.
well, actually research, blah, 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 blah?
Oh yeah. Yep. I use the word racist, to be honest, when it comes right down to it, because I think it's easier to just name it and move on from it. I'm very careful not to call anyone racist, but to say that those are racist ideas. Yeah. Yeah, good question. Yeah. Awesome.
This is a fabulous session, and I don't want to cut off conversation, but I do want to respect it. We are at our 2 hours, and our next session starts at 11:20. Yeah, I'm not stopping conversation, but I'm pointing out the clock.
I think it's a good stopping point. And yeah, please feel free to email me, anybody. Y'all take care.
Thank you very much, Anna.
Yeah, absolutely. Bye, everybody.